Well, good evening. It's 10:30 here in the UK. One or two interesting things over the past few days, obviously. Just quickly check and make sure that everything is working as it should do. It seems to be the case. So yeah, that's good. Okay. Obviously, the George Floyd murder is being the repercussions of it are being felt around the world, even down in London. There were protest marches, and I've got an article that's quite interesting. Hi, Jamie. Hi, Julie. That's quite interesting. Deals with that. Couple of latest bits of news. Lawyers are wanting Officer Derek Chauvin to be charged with first-degree murder based on the fact that the autopsy has revealed that George Floyd did indeed meet the maker as a result of asphyxiation. It's quite bizarre to see two officers kneeling on his back and Derek Chauvin putting his knee into the poor guy's neck. It reminds me of how a constrictor snake would kill its prey. It was quite obscene, as is quite a lot of the other stuff. I don't know if you saw some of the footage of the guy in Salt Lake City who got out of his SUV and got a crossbow and was about to aim it at protesters when they realized what was going on. What was the second order? Well, the latest news as far as the autopsy is that George Floyd did indeed die of asphyxiation. And therefore, the lawyers are wanting Derek Chauvin to be charged with first-degree murder. An interesting thing I saw earlier, something about the fact that in all these protests, the police have made over 4,000 arrests, but they still haven't arrested the other three officers involved in George Floyd's murder. I'm afraid you can't describe it in any other way. It's quite clear. Derek Chauvin's got quite a few problems, including the fact that even his wife has filed for divorce, which maybe doesn't surprise us. We've also got, just earlier, we discovered that as far as the Kathleen Zellner is concerned, she has filed for to be given more time to prepare her response, and has asked, as the state did, have asked for the word count, the word limit to be increased. She obviously has a lot to say. And interesting that she wants more time. I kind of speculated that she probably knew exactly what the state were going to say, but she probably wants time just to check everything that they've come up with, and to find out where they've been sloppy and have made mistakes, and also obviously to get her take on her perspective. She obviously is going to give it a bit of time, before she decides what to do. I must admit, one of the things I was going to do back it was either Thursday or Friday, was to have a look at the case of Amy Cooper. I don't know if any of you have, maybe you've seen it, maybe forgotten about her. She was the lady that in Central Park called the police to say that she was being threatened. Her life and her dog, the lives of her dog and her were being threatened by an ornithologist who had simply asked her to put her dog on the lead. Her name, as I say, Amy Cooper. I wonder if that's the same as my good friend Tess Sanders, who was threatening me with all sorts of litigation and closing down my YouTube channel. But anyway, enough of that stupidity and idiocracy. I could tell last night that that the dude was getting a bit upset. Didn't quite understand what was going on. Here in the UK, we've had obviously football violence a long time, and I think that this article is written by the guy that has done a lot of study of social unrest, particularly in the field of football hooliganism. So I wanted to share this with you. Hopefully this will work. No guarantee. Hopefully it'll work. Let's see. So let's have a look. Make sure that everything works as it should do. Yes. This is a particularly interesting article. George Floyd death. Why do some protests turn violent? I say we're going to get the some of the interesting stories at the side here. Floyd died of asphyxia. Private post-mortem. So this is by Helia Chang, BBC News, Washington. And it deals with riots in England in 2011. So we'll just read through what it says. Curfews have been imposed in multiple cities in the US after unrest and protests have spread across the country over the death of an unarmed man, George Floyd, whilst in police custody. Most of the protests began peacefully and several stayed peaceful, but in a large number of cases, demonstrators clashed with police, set police cars on fire, vandalized property, or looted shops. The National Guard has activated 5,000 of its personnel across 15 states and Washington, D.C. Experts have also drawn parallels with the 2011 riots in England, when a peaceful protest over a man who was shot dead by police turned into 4 days of unrest, with widespread looting and buildings set alight. Let's come on down. Protests spread when there's a shared identity. Incidents like Mr. Floyd's death can become a trigger moment because it symbolizes a broader experience amongst much larger numbers of people about the relationship between police and the Black community, says Professor Clifford Stott, an expert in crowd behavior and public order policing at Keele University. Keele, I'm sure that our good friend Jane Sharp is somewhere very near to Keele. And if in fact, she might even be in Keele. So anyway, don't know if Jane knows Clifford Stott. Anyway, confrontations are particularly likely when there are structural inequalities, he adds. Professor Stott studied the 2011 England riots extensively and found that the riots there spread because protesters in different cities identified with each other, either because of their ethnicity or because they shared a dislike of the police. This meant that when the police appeared to be overwhelmed, rioters in different districts felt empowered to mobilize. How the police respond matters. Violent protests are less likely when police have a good relationship with the local community, but how they react to demonstrations on the day also matters, experts say. And this was in Los Angeles, this picture. And I'm just going to point out a kind of a generalistic thing, but there seems to be amongst the crowd a real mixture of people with regards to their skin color. Riots are a product of interactions largely to do with the nature of the way police treat crowds, said Professor Stott. For example, he says, in a large crowd of protesters, tensions may begin with just a few people confronting the police. However, police often react towards the crowd as a whole, and if people feel that the police use of force against them is unjustified, this increases their us versus them mentality. This can change the way people feel about violence and confrontation. For example, they may start feeling that violence is legitimate given the circumstances. Darnell Hunt, Dean of Social Sciences at UCLA, believes police in the US ramped up their aggressiveness over the weekend, deploying the National Guard, using rubber bullets, tear gas, and pepper spray. These are a range of police tactics that can exasperate an already tense situation. It's a pattern. It's a pattern that has been seen in other protests around the world too. For example, in 2019, Hong Kong saw 7 months of anti-government protests that began as mostly peaceful and ended up increasingly violent. Experts highlight a series of police tactics that were seen as heavy-handed, including the firing of large amounts of tear gas at young protesters, as moves that galvanized protesters and made them more confrontational. Professor Stott argues that police forces that have invested in de-escalation training are more likely to avoid violence at protests. He points to protests that were able to stay peaceful in the US over the weekend, such as in Camden, New Jersey, where officers joined the residents in a march against racism. It also depends on what's at stake. Moral psychology can help explain why some protests turn violent, says Marloon Mujiman, an assistant professor in organizational behavior at Rice University. A person's sense of morality is central to how they see themselves. So when we see something as immoral, it creates strong feelings because we feel our understanding of morality has to be protected. This can override other concerns people have about keeping peace, because if you think the system is broken, you're going to want to really do something drastic to show that that's not acceptable. This can apply to a wide range of beliefs. For example, in an extreme case, someone who thinks abortion is a moral outrage may be more likely to say it's okay to bomb an abortion clinic, he says. Research suggests that social media echo chambers could also make people more susceptible to endorsing violence if they believe that their peers have the same moral views as them, he adds. Looting and vandalism can be more targeted than you think. In the US, hundreds of businesses have been damaged, and there has been widespread looting in LA and Minneapolis over the weekend. However, Professor Stott warns that while it's easy to assume that riots and crowds are irrational and chaotic, none of that is true. It's highly structured and meaningful for the people taking part. To some extent, looting is an expression of power. Black citizens may have felt disempowered in relation to the police, but in the context of a riot, the rioters momentarily become more powerful than the police. Studies of previous riots show that places that get looted are often related to big businesses, and that looting often relates to the sense of inequality related to living in capitalistic economies, he says. An Apple store in Los Angeles was among those looted. My goodness. Somebody's walking away with a computer by the looks of it. Professor Hunt has studied the 1992 Los Angeles riots, which were sparked off after 4 white police officers were acquitted after the videotaped beating of a black motorist, Rodney King. He says there is a long history of targeting or selectivity in vandalism and looting. In the LA uprisings, you'd often see minority-owned spray painted on minority businesses so that people would bypass those. However, both Professor Stott and Professor Hunt caution that looting is complicated, especially as lots of people with different motivations take part, including people in poverty or organized criminals. The idea that violent protests are targeted and meaningful events to those taking part can also explain why looting occurs in some protests but not others. In Hong Kong, for example, protesters smashed shop windows, threw petrol bombs at police, and defaced the national emblem, but there was no looting. Lawrence Ho, a specialist in policing and public order management at the Education University of Hong Kong, believes this is because those protests were triggered by political developments and anger at the police rather than discrimination and social inequality. Vandalism was targeted at stores seemed to have a strong connection to mainland China, said Dr. Ho. It was a deliberate attempt to convey a message. So, next question. How can violence be prevented? Police or public order experts say that for the police, being seen as legitimate and able to engage protesters in dialogue is key. Good policing tries to avoid an us and them mentality and also tries to avoid the sense that police can act in ways that people see as illegitimate, says Professor Stott. Dr. Ho also believes that negotiation is the best way, but points out that one of the hardest things today is that a lot of protests are leaderless. If you can't find the leader, you can't negotiate with them. More generally, he adds, politicians can make matters better or worse based on their approach to dialogue and whether they use emergency legislation. Ultimately, however, riots can be a symptom of deep-seated tensions and complicated issues that don't have an easy solution. Professor Hunt says this week's US riots are the most serious ones since 1968, after Martin Luther King was assassinated. You can't think about police brutality and the profiling of certain communities without thinking about the inequalities that exist in society and fuel those concerns, he says. The George Floyd case was not the cause. It's more like the straw that broke the camel's back. You could argue even the police killings are symptoms. The underlying cause is white supremacy, racism, and things the US has not fundamentally dealt with. So I kind of take from that there is, dare I say it, a certain criticism for certain people sat in power, suggesting that the police be very heavy-handed. As I say, we saw I'm sure a lot of us saw the guy that drew out his crossbow and was about to aim it at protesters and shouted something. And I think we also saw, most of us probably saw that tanker driver that drove straight into the crowd of people that had to suddenly disperse. You can't help thinking they're a bit deluded in trying to do what they did. One of the things I take away from this whole situation, of course, is the fact that people do have an anger against injustice in general. They feel very annoyed in the same way that we feel very, very annoyed at the way that Stephen and Brendan have been treated. And if anything good is going to come of this, it's going to be, this sort of realization amongst sort of people sat on the fence, if you like. They're gonna maybe realize that that there is it's gonna make some people become even more hardline. We need to stamp on these people. We need to crush them for their heinous acts. There's going to be others that are going to see the problem for what it is, that there is just so much injustice. That would be my take. Anyway, so I haven't really watched much of the much of the chat. I must admit, I did ask the dude if he was finished, if he was still working, and of course, with an 8-hour difference, there was, he's not around. Hopefully, he'll get on the and do another video. As I say, I'm a bit older than him. I remember some of the riots in the 80s in the UK. And as I say, I certainly remember the one in 2011, which was mainly centered down in London. And of course, there's been, some pretty bad riots. That there was one in which a police officer was murdered. Just murdered just for the sake that, just because he was a policeman, which is obviously it's bizarre. And of course, Eric Ozee last night shared with us the tweet where the shop owner, an innocent shop owner, met his maker simply because people decided that they didn't like him because he represented something that they didn't like, or maybe because they were trying to rob this. Who knows? Hopefully they will be apprehended. They've got the footage. It can't be too difficult in this day and age to identify everybody that was involved in attacking the store owner. So as I say, just to recap, as regards making a murderer, Kathleen has filed for an extension and an increased word count, which for me is, it's she's obviously planning on ripping into the state, and she's obviously going to do a little bit of research and probably check every dot and every crossed T that the state has come up with, and is planning to really take them to town on this one. So although it's going to, there could possibly be obviously a delay. I don't see how they wouldn't grant Kathleen an extension, seeing as they gave the state one. So that's going to be maybe not by the 11th, in 10 days' time, that we get to see the response from Kathleen Zellner. But also, as I say, there's calls now for officer. Well, he's not an officer anymore. He's gone to a maximum security prison, which apparently is a level 5. It's the only one in Minnesota. It's right on the border with Wisconsin. His wife has left him. Probably she should have maybe done that quite a while ago. So I think we've just about covered everything up to date. And maybe the dude will do a live later on, and I've left a bit of meat on the bone for him to have a look at. Anyway, thank you all for joining us. I do apologize. I've been posting one or two kind of funny videos, but there were mitigating circumstances due to stuff like birthdays and stuff like that coming up. So anyway, listen, we'll catch you all again soon. And I've been putting one or two feelers out to try and get one or two people to come and join me for a chat. Other than his lordship, the dude, who knows? You never know. I suppose I should be careful what I wish for. So anyway, listen, we'll catch you all again soon. Thanks for tuning in. So I don't know if his dudeness is doing anything later on, but if he is, then enjoy, and we'll catch you all again soon. Bye for now. Cheerio.